Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We have a really cool question from one of our listeners, and it takes us, well, pretty far back in time. They're asking about Watson Brake, and specifically if there are other sites like it up the Wachita River.
Yeah, so this takes us deep into prehistory, even before that well-known Poverty Point site.
Right.
We're talking about Watson Brake, which is a Middle Archaic mound complex in northeast Louisiana, and it's unique because it's the biggest and most complex site from that period.
Yeah, so to help answer our listener's question, I
Yeah.
think we need to accomplish two things.
Mm-hmm.
First, we need to lay out what Watson Brake is, how it's laid out on the land, the people who built it, and maybe even get into their culture.
Okay.
And then we'll dive into how we can look for similar sites up the Wachita River.
Yeah.
So what kinds of things can we use to find other sites like Watson Brake, like their tools or how the land is laid out? And luckily for us, we have three really detailed sources all about the archaeology at Watson Brake.
All right. Well, to get started, let's picture what this site looks like.
Okay.
Yeah, on the ground.
So Watson Brake is it's an oval arrangement of 11 earthen mounds.
Okay.
And they're not just random mounds, but two curved rows of mounds connected by ridges. You have a north and a south row.
Interesting. Okay, so it's a huge oval, and how big are we talking?
It's about 300 meters long
Wow.
and 200 meters across.
Okay.
And then in the middle, you have this pretty level space enclosed by all the mounds.
All right. And what about the mounds themselves? How tall are they?
Well, the tallest one is called Gentry Mound.
Mm.
They also call it Mound A, and it's 7.5 meters high.
Wow, that's a pretty substantial mound.
Right. It must have taken a huge amount of effort to build that.
Yeah, definitely. So
Right.
so where exactly is this located?
Well, it sits on the edge of this alluvial terrace.
Formed by the Wachita River way back during the late Pleistocene.
And where's the river now?
Well, now it's about 500 meters to the east of the site.
Okay.
And there's also this little tributary just west of Watson Brake. It's actually called Watson Brake.
Gotcha.
And that's where the site gets its name. Back then, it would have been this swampy floodplain.
Okay. Interesting. So why do you think they abandoned the site?
Well, there's an interesting idea about that. It seems like there were these natural levees, which are these ridges of sediment, deposited by the river, and they probably formed across the mouth of the Watson Brake tributary sometime between 3000 and 2000 BC.
Okay.
And that would cut it off from the river, essentially making it into this stagnant swamp.
Right.
So maybe that made it less desirable or just harder to live there. Maybe they couldn't get the resources they needed.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like a pretty strategic location, too.
Right. And it's in what we call an ecotone. So it's like where two environments meet.
Oh, interesting.
In this case, it's between the river area and the higher uplands.
Okay.
And that makes it great for resources. So the uplands would have had, deer and stuff.
Right.
While the river and the wetlands would have had all sorts of fish.
Yeah.
Our sources also say that the area had a lot of edible plants.
And the chert gravels, right?
Yes. And of course, the chert gravels, which they used for their tools.
Right. So it sounds like they had everything they needed right there. Food, water, materials for tools.
Right. It's like a prime spot.
Okay, so let's talk about how we even know about Watson Brake.
Yeah.
When was it discovered?
Well, it was first found back in 1981.
Oh, okay.
And initially they thought it might be from the Poverty Point period, just based on what they saw on the surface.
Okay, I see.
But then a few years later, in 1992, they did a soil analysis, a pedological analysis.
Right.
And they found that Mound A was much older, like way older.
Wow.
It was from the Middle Archaic period.
So that changed everything then.
It did. It completely changed the way they looked at the site. And then they started doing all these investigations from 1993 to 1999.
Okay, so that's how they really figured out the timeline.
Right. And they used all sorts of dating methods like radiocarbon dating and luminescence dating. And they found that most of the construction happened between 3500 BC and sometime after 3000 BC.
Okay, so now that we have a good idea of where Watson Brake is and when it was built,
Mm-hmm.
let's get into how they actually built these mounds. What do we know about that?
Well, they did a bunch of coring, taking
Mhm.
samples from the mounds, and then they looked at the layers, the stratigraphy.
Okay.
And combined with those dating methods, they were able to figure out the sequence of events.
Gotcha.
And it looks like they started with some smaller earthworks around 3500 BC.
Okay.
And these early works had an oval arrangement of burned rock middens.
Oh, interesting.
So basically, old cooking areas, with all those fire-cracked stones.
Right.
Even at this early stage, they were already using this oval shape, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So even before the big mounds, there was some kind of defined space and people were living there.
Exactly. And then around 3350 BC, they started, really building up the mounds.
Right.
And that went on for a while, probably in phases,
Right.
until after 3000 BC, when the site seems to have been abandoned.
Okay, so they were living on the mounds while they were building them.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
How do we know that?
Well, in the mound fills, they found layers of soil, like the soil that forms when you have a surface that's being used.
Gotcha.
And they also found scattered artifacts like stone tools, more fire-cracked rock, and pieces of fired clay.
Okay.
So it seems like they were living on these mounds and using them even as they were still building them up.
That's really fascinating. I mean, it wasn't just like a construction site, right?
Right.
It was like their home.
Exactly. It was a dynamic process. They were living and building at the same time.
Right, right. So what did they use to build these mounds? Like what kinds of materials?
Well, it depends on which mound you're talking about.
Oh, okay.
The ones in the north, closer to the edge of the terrace, they have a lot of gravel in them.
Okay.
So it seems like they were quarrying gravel from the terrace itself.
Okay, that makes sense.
Some of the southern mounds near the terrace edge also have gravel, but the others seem to be made mostly from bulk sediment,
Okay.
which they probably got from digging borrow pits,
Yeah.
Areas where they just took out a lot of dirt.
Right, right. Like big holes in the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And they've found different types of sediment too, like loam and sandy loam in the north.
Okay.
And then more clay loam in the south. So it seems like they are using materials from all over the surrounding area.
Yeah, that makes sense. They were just using what was, readily available. Now, how coordinated was all this construction? I mean, were they all building at the same time, or did they work on different mounds at different times?
That's a good question. And it seems like there was some level of coordination when you look at the dates, particularly around 3500 BC when they were doing those early earthworks.
Right.
And then again around 3350 BC when they started building the big mounds.
Okay.
But it wasn't like everybody was working on everything all at once.
Right.
There were definitely pauses at some of the mounds.
Uh-huh.
For example, the last dated event they have is for Mound J2 around 3000 BC. But then there's evidence that they were still working on J3 even later.
Okay.
So it's a bit of a mix. But there's definitely some evidence of, people working together, maybe communal effort.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right.
Well, so far we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We've got a sense of the layout of Watson Break.
Yeah.
The timeline, how it was built. Now, I think it's time to turn our attention to the people themselves. What can we learn about them?
Mm-hmm.
And a good place to start would be the stuff they left behind.
Right.
The artifacts.
Okay, so one of the most common things they find is, you guessed it, fire-cracked rock.
Okay, so more fire-cracked rock, but what does that tell us?
Well, most of it's that local chert gravel, and they find higher concentrations in the northern mounds.
Okay.
So maybe they were either reusing material from those older cooking areas, the burned rock middens,
Right.
or maybe they were bringing fresh gravel onto the mounds for cooking or heating.
Right.
Either way, it tells us something about how they prepared their food.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about their tools, like their stone tools?
Well, they find those too, and again, mostly made from those small chert gravels.
Okay.
And they're mostly in the northern mounds as well. And the distribution kind of follows that same pattern we talked about with the fire-cracked rock. Generally lower densities in the upper layers.
Right.
But there are some interesting exceptions.
Oh, yeah.
For example, in the upper part of Mound D, they found this thin clay surface with a lot of flakes.
Okay.
And they think that might have been a temporary workshop, where they were making or fixing tools.
Okay, so like a dedicated space for working with stone.
Yeah, exactly. And they also found high densities of lithics on some of those buried surfaces within Ridge KA
Right.
and at the base of Mound C.
Yeah.
So these were areas where they were, really active.
Okay, so let's talk about numbers for a second.
Okay.
How many stone tools did they actually find?
Oh, they found a lot. Over 32,000 pieces.
Wow, that's a huge number.
Right. But here's the interesting thing. Only a tiny fraction of those were finished tools,
Okay.
like formal tools, carefully shaped. Only about 1.2%.
Oh, wow.
And even fewer cores.
And cores are...
Cores are what's left over after you nap the stone.
Right.
So only about 0.5%.
So that's pretty surprising, right?
Yeah, it is. So maybe they weren't too focused on making, these fancy finished tools.
Right.
Maybe they were just making tools as they needed them.
Right, right. So it seems like practicality over, aesthetics or craftsmanship.
Right.
Did they find any specific types of tools, like arrowheads or other types of points?
Yeah, they found a few Evans points, Ellis points, and even one Pontchartrain point.
Okay, and those are all...
Those are all types of projectile points.
Right, right. And those are important
Like
because...
especially the Evans points.
Okay.
Because they're typically associated with the Middle Archaic period,
Yeah.
so that helps confirm the dating of Watson Brake.
Makes sense. Okay, so they were definitely making these projectile points at the site.
Yeah, yeah. They also found some unfinished bifaces.
Okay, so those are
Those are tools that are shaped on both sides.
gotcha.
And they also found all the waste flakes, from making the tools.
Okay.
So that's more evidence that they were making tools right there.
Right, right. They were, a self-sufficient group. What about those bladelets and microdrills you mentioned before?
Yeah, so they did find some bladelets, but not as many as you'd find at later sites like Poverty Point.
Okay.
And the ones they did find were pretty small,
Okay.
and a lot of them still had the cortex on them.
And the cortex is the
The cortex is the outer layer of the stone.
gotcha.
So it seems like they weren't as concerned with, removing all that before making the bladelets.
Right. So what were they using these bladelets for?
Well, it seems like some of them were used to make drills and microdrills.
Oh, okay.
And these microdrills, they're really tiny
Okay.
and often have these steeply retouched edges.
Okay.
And some are even blunt at both ends
Oh, interesting.
or tapered at both ends.
Okay.
And guess where they found a lot of these microdrills?
I don't know. Where?
On that clayey surface between layers, D3 and D4 in Mound D.
Oh, right.
That possible workshop area.
Right, right. So it really seems like they were using that space for making tools.
It does.
What would they have used those microdrills for?
Well, they were probably used for, really precise work, like maybe drilling holes in leather or wood.
Okay, so it shows like a real attention to detail and some skill.
Absolutely. It takes a lot of precision to make
Yeah.
and use those kinds of tools.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, what other kinds of stone artifacts did they find?
Well, they found some chert beads,
Okay.
but those were mostly in the later fill layers
Okay.
and not really associated with the microdrill workshops.
Okay, and what were these beads made of?
Mostly the local chert, but they also found one that was made from a fossil crinoid stem.
Oh,
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So it seems like they would take a piece of chert
right.
and then flake it and then grind it to make it smooth.
Okay.
And then they'd flatten the ends
Okay.
and then drill these little facets into the ends.
Wow, that's a pretty involved process, right?
Yeah, it definitely shows some skill and patience.
Right. So we've talked about the flaked stone tools.
Mm-hmm.
What about the non-flaked ones?
Oh, right. So they also found tools that weren't made by chipping away at stone,
Yeah.
like hammer stones
Okay.
and abraders, which they use for grinding,
Right.
and even handheld grindstones,
Okay.
and one metate.
And metates were used for.
Metates were used for grinding plant foods,
Right. And what were those tools made of?
things like siltstone and sandstone,
Okay.
and they found them all over the site.
Okay. So not really concentrated in any particular area.
Right.
Now, what about tools made from, things like bone or antler?
Yeah, unfortunately, those are much rarer,
Okay.
probably because the soil is pretty acidic,
Right.
and that doesn't, help preserve organic material.
Okay.
But they did find a few bone and antler tools at the base of Mound B
Sure.
in a shell midden.
Right. And those are
Those are, basically ancient trash heaps
right.
full of shells.
Gotcha.
And the shells actually help preserve the bone and antler.
How so?
Well, the calcium carbonate from the shells raises the pH of the soil,
Okay.
and that makes it less acidic.
Right. So what did they find in the shell midden?
Well, they found some bone awls.
Okay. And awls are?
Awls are these pointed tools, used for piercing things,
Okay.
and maybe a fragment of a fishhook,
Oh, cool.
and a bone spatula, and a finished bone bead,
Okay.
and some bone bead blanks.
So they were making beads from bone too.
It looks like it. And they even found a piece of bone that was stained with red pigment. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it seems like they were using color,
Right.
and they also found one antler flaker.
And those were used for?
Those were used for shaping stone tools.
Gotcha.
By pressing on the stone with the antler.
Right, right. It's amazing, how much we can learn from these small remnants of their lives.
It really is. Even after thousands of years, these little pieces can tell us so much.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so you mentioned manuports in the outline, and I've heard that word before, but what are they exactly?
Manuports are objects that people brought to the site,
Okay.
but didn't actually modify or use as tools or anything.
Okay.
So at Watson Brake, they found things like a piece of quartz crystal
Okay.
and some fossils, mostly crinoid stems,
Okay.
and then red jasper pebbles,
Okay.
and lumps of hematite and limonite.
And those are
Those are iron ores,
okay.
and they might have been used for pigment.
Yeah. And even some pieces of slate.
So they were bringing in all these different materials, but why?
Well, we can't know for sure.
Right.
But it's possible that these objects had some, symbolic or ritual significance
Okay.
because they were found, scattered within the mounds.
Right.
So maybe they were placed there intentionally.
Okay. Yeah. It seems like they were picking these objects for a reason,
Right.
and just randomly collecting them.
Right.
So they found stuff from later time periods too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. In the upper levels of the mounds, they found a hematite plummet
Okay.
and a biconical fired clay object,
Okay.
which are both typical of the Poverty Point period.
Right. So much later than Watson Brake.
Right. And they also found some pottery sherds from the defunct period, which is, even more recent.
Right. So how did that stuff get there?
Well, it's probably because people were visiting the site, long after it was abandoned.
Yeah.
And also because of things like, soil disturbance.
Right. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Right. Just because you find something at a site doesn't mean it's, from the same time period as everything else.
Exactly. Okay, so there's one more category of artifacts we need to talk about, and those are the fired earthen objects.
Oh, right. Yeah, those are pretty interesting.
So tell me about those.
Well, they found a lot of them. Over 34 kilograms worth.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And they're relatively small,
Okay.
less than 10 centimeters long.
Okay.
And they come in all sorts of geometric shapes, like cubes, rectangles, cylinders, rounded cubes, spheres, you name it.
Wow, so like a whole variety of shapes. But what were they used for?
That's the thing. We don't really know.
Oh, okay.
But they're not found in the same places as, the other artifacts.
Right.
So maybe they were used for something different, like maybe cooking
Okay.
or heat retention, or even some kind of counting or gaming.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of a mystery.
Right, but they found them at other sites too, right?
Yeah. They've found similar objects at other Middle Archaic sites in the region.
Okay.
So it seems like they were a pretty common thing during that time.
Okay, so it seems like we've got a pretty good handle on the stuff they left behind.
We do.
But what about features? Things that they built or dug into the ground.
Okay. So they haven't excavated that much of the site,
Okay.
but in the areas they have, they found some interesting things.
Right.
6 small pit outlines
Okay.
in the northern mounds.
Okay.
And they think those were probably hearths or cooking pits.
Okay. So basically fire pits.
Yeah, exactly.
And they were different sizes, right?
Right. And they had different things in them, like charcoal, burn shell. Some had organically enriched sediment.
Okay.
And one even had pieces of fired clay.
Oh, interesting.
And the oldest one was under Mound B.
Okay.
And that one had charcoal and burn shell.
Okay. So that's pretty clear evidence that they were, using fire in those pits.
Right.
What about evidence for structures, like houses or anything like that?
Well, they found 3 post holes,
Okay.
but those were all on the original terrace surface,
Okay.
under the mounds and the ridges. So,
Yeah.
so maybe there were some structures there before they started building the mounds.
Right.
They also found 3 shallow depressions under Mound A,
Okay.
but those were probably just, where trees had been uprooted,
Cool.
not something people made.
Right. Now, what about the enclosed area?
Oh, the area inside the ring of mounds.
Yeah. Was that used for anything?
Well, it seems like it was mostly empty.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they used those auger probes
Right.
to take soil samples, and they didn't find many artifacts.
Oh, interesting. So they were keeping that area clean then.
It seems like it, yeah.
So do we know what they used it for?
Well, we don't know for sure,
Right.
but maybe it was a gathering space,
Okay.
for the whole community,
Oh.
or maybe it had some ritual significance.
Okay.
And they wanted to keep it, free of debris.
Right. Yeah, it's really intriguing to think about, how they were using that space.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered the artifacts and the features,
Mm-hmm.
but what about, the most basic thing? What did these people eat?
Okay, so remember how the soil is pretty acidic?
Right.
Well, that means the preservation of, organic remains is pretty bad.
Okay, so not a lot of food remains left behind.
Right. But there's one exception
Okay.
at the base of Mound B
Oh, okay.
in the B2R and B1 levels.
Okay.
They found a bunch of faunal and macroplant remains.
And that's because,
Well, the pH was higher there.
right, because of the shells.
Exactly.
So what did they find?
Well, a lot of different animals.
Okay.
At least 56 different species.
Wow.
And most of them were from the river and the wetlands. So things like beaver, raccoon, different waterfowl, turtles, snakes, amphibians, and lots of fish.
Wow.
And then they also found some animals from the uplands and more open areas,
Okay.
like deer and turkey.
Okay, so like a real mix of animals.
Right. They were, taking advantage of all the different habitats around them.
Right. So
Mhm.
so which animals were they eating the most?
Well, if you go by weight,
Okay.
fish bones make up over half the total weight.
Oh, wow. So fish was a really big part of their diet.
It was, and then deer was next
Okay.
at about 30%.
So those were their main sources of meat.
Yeah, it looks like it. And the deer bones were often really broken up.
Okay.
So maybe they were processing them somewhere else and then
Okay.
only bringing back the meaty parts to the site.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we know